Hi friends, my name is Baji. Welcome to our channel. In our previous video, we looked into different methods of recording the JMeter script. If you haven't watched that video yet, I highly recommend watching that first and then continuing this video. After recording the script, two main customization need to be made before it is ready to be used for test executions. Number one, parameterization, and number two, correlation. In today's video, we will talk about parameterization concept, and in the upcoming video, we will cover correlation. Okay. During the script recording, based on the application functionality, we might be giving a lot of inputs to the application, right? For example, in our Blaze demo application, we have selected from and to destination, and also while purchasing the ticket, we have provided user information, isn't it? So, JMeter will capture and include all these actual input values in the script. Executing the test with the same values with multiple users is not a realistic scenario. For example, in the login transaction of any application, every user will use their own username and password, right? They won't use the same username and password. Another issue of using the same values in multiple requests can lead to potential cache related issues, especially in scenarios where caching is involved. Web applications often employ caching mechanism to store and reuse data to improve performance. If the same parameter value is repeatedly used, the response may be cached, leading to inaccurate test results as subsequent requests may not go through the full processing cycle. To address all these different challenges, we will parameterize the user input values from those used during recording. Okay, so the process of replacing the original input values with the parameters or variables is called parameterization. You can reference these variables using the syntax dollar within flower brackets variable name. For example, if you define the username as a variable, then you should write the syntax as dollar within flower brackets username, and this username can be used to replace the original username value. Okay, in JMeter we can handle this parameterization using different elements like user defined variables, user parameters, CSV Data Set Config. These are some of the basics ones which everyone should be aware of. Depending on the requirements, we might be using some other elements to parameterize the user inputs. Okay, now let's try to understand the user defined variables element. User defined variables is a config element, and depending on the place it is configured, the variable scope will be determined. This is suitable to parameterize the static variables which will be used in more than one place in the script. For example, like host name, protocol, port. The variables created in this element are the same for all threads. They aren't unique to each thread. Okay. In this element, each variable can hold one value. It is not possible to store multiple values for the same variable. Next, let's discuss the user parameters element. It is a preprocessor element and it will be executed after the config element. With the help of this element, we can define the user specific variables for individual threads that are unique to those threads. This element is mainly suitable for scenarios that have fewer test data values and that can be used repetitively during performance test execution. It is possible to assign multiple values to the variables defined in this element. For example, the username variable can hold different usernames for different threads. Next, let's look at CSV Data Set Config. CSV Data Set Config is a config element and it is the most commonly used element for parameterization. Using this element, we can read the data from a CSV file and use it in the script. This is most suitable for those scenarios where input values have to be changed in the script in each iteration. Like the user parameters element, we can store multiple values for each variable. In fact, we can store more values and this element will be used for larger test data driven scenarios. So in the CSV dataset config element, we have an important configuration called sharing mode that determines how the test data is shared among various threads. We have four options to choose from, like all threads, current thread group, current thread, and edit. Now let's explore each option in more detail. In all threads option, the CSV file will be shared between threads. In each request, each thread will read only one line sequentially. For instance, if there are three threads set up in the thread group, each executing one iteration, and the CSV file has 3 lines of data, the first user will use the data from line 1, the second user from line 2, and the third user from line 3. If we have more iterations than the data, then they will access the data in a cyclic manner. Okay. So in current thread group option, CSV file will be opened by each thread group separately. That means each thread in every thread group reads the CSV file independently, starting from the beginning and progressing to the end without affecting one another. For example, we have two thread groups with 3 threads each. Then each user from the thread group will read the same data. So first thread from the both thread groups will read the line item 1, and the second threads from the both thread groups will read the second item, and so on. Okay. In the current thread group option, each thread will open the CSV file independently and read the first item in the first iteration and the second item in the second iteration and so on. And lastly, if we select edit option, this field changes into an input field. This allows us to input our string instead of using the predefined options. Using this element, we have the flexibility to select various thread groups and share the file among them. Now let's put this element into practice in JMeter to understand the concept of parameterization. So first let's open JMeter. To save some time, I have already recorded a Blaze demo script using BlazeMeter Chrome extension method. So this is a raw script and I haven't made any customizations to it. Okay, in this script we can see 3 config elements and 1 thread group with 4 transaction controllers and 2 listener elements. Okay, so again each transaction controller has one HTTP request sampler with some input values. For example, if you go to find plus transaction, we can see 2 different inputs. Similarly, if you go to purchase flight transaction, you can see different inputs. So all these input values need to be parameterized. Okay, now let's add the user defined variables and parameterize the static variables. So we can add that user defined variables in the test plan level. So right click the test plan and then click add and then go to config element and then user defined variables. We already talked about this user defined variables in our previous videos. So using this element we will parameterize the server name, port protocol and port number. The reason for choosing these fields is in user defined variables we cannot choose multiple values for each variable. For example, if you go to purchase flight, we have different input values. We cannot parameterize them using user defined because in each variable we may need to store multiple values. We may need to test this scenario with multiple users, right? So we need to feed that username into that variable. So we cannot achieve that using user defined variable elements. That is why we are parameterizing the variables which holds only one value. Okay, so in this demo script we can see like the protocol, server name and port can only hold one value. That is why we have chosen those fields to parameterize. So let's go to the user defined variables and add 3 variables. So to add any variables we need to click add button, then type the variable name, let's say protocol. So variable name is case sensitive. Make sure when you are replacing the input value with the variable, make sure you use the exact case. Okay, to make it easy I am defining everything in lowercase and the value for this variable is HTTPS. And if you want to give some description you can also do that by adding it here. Let's add the second variable which is server name. Here the server name is blazedemo.com and finally the port number. Port actual value is 443. We have defined 3 variables and now we need to replace these variables with the actual value. So we need to go back to each HTTP sampler request. Wherever we see those values we need to replace them with the variable names. So for protocol we have defined the variable as protocol. So to define a variable we need to follow the syntax first. First we need to type dollar within flower brackets we need to type the variable name. So protocol. Similarly for server name dollar within flower brackets server name. Same thing for port as well, dollar within flower brackets port. So we need to repeat the same thing for all 4 requests. So let's quickly do that. Protocol and then dollar server name dollar port. Then go to transaction 3. Same thing, protocol and dollar server name within flower brackets and then dollar within flower brackets port. And finally 4th transaction, dollar within flower brackets protocol and again dollar within flower brackets server name and dollar within flower brackets port. So now we have replaced all the input values with the variables, right? So let's run the script to make sure that it is working as expected. So let's run it and then go to view results to verify the results. So expand the transaction 1 and then if you go to Blaze demo, go to the request, then we can see blazedemo.com has been replaced. Similarly, if you go to the next transaction, here also we can see the protocol has replaced as HTTPS and the server name as blazedemo.com. Similarly, for other transactions also we can see the replacement. Okay, so like this we can define the required static variables and replace wherever it is needed. You might be thinking why we have used user defined variables. We can also use the HTTP request defaults config element, right, to achieve the same thing. We can also do that. That is another approach to handle those static variables, but I just wanted to explain you how we can do the parameterization using user defined variables. Okay, now let's discuss the second element, which is user parameters. To save some time I have already created a separate script to explain this element. So in this script I have one thread group with configuration of 3 threads and then loop count as 3. Okay, and I also have one dummy sampler. So this is the plugin that I have installed. By default this plugin is not available. If you want dummy sampler, then you need to go to options menu and then plugin manager, and in the available plugins you look for dummy. Since I have already installed it, it is not showing up here, but if I go back to install plugins, I can see dummy sampler. So once you install this plugin, then you can right click the thread group, add sampler, and then dummy sampler. Okay, so you must be wondering why I am using dummy sampler instead of regular HTTP request samplers, right? So replacing the actual value with parameter is pretty much same in any variables, but I just wanted to explain how JMeter distributes the data to the threads when we execute the script. So that is why I have used this dummy sampler, and so inside this dummy sampler I have used a couple of functions, thread num and then int sum. So don't worry about these functions. We will have a separate video for functions alone. So in that video I will explain what exactly these functions are and then how to use them. The purpose of using those functions here is that I just wanted to get the output as thread 1, iteration 1 and the variable with the values. So when we run this script for multiple iterations, we can see the thread information as well as the value that it is picking. Okay, so now let's add the user parameter elements. Again, we will add that element in the test plan level. So right click on the test plan, add, since it is a preprocessor element, go to preprocessor and then select user parameters. In this screen we will add required variables and the values. So to add a variable, click add variable. Then we need to define the variable name and the value. So by default it will only show user1, but if you want to more number of users, then you need to click add user. And if you want to delete any number of users, then you can select that user and then delete. So let's add 3 users and then define the variable name as username and define the values for that user name. So let's say user1, user2 and then user3, and then add another variable like password, pass1, pass2 and pass3. Let's add another variable country and say India, Canada and USA. Okay, so these are the 3 different variables that we have added, and each variable we stored multiple values for each user. For example, user1 holds user1 for username variable and then user2 holds user2 for username and so on. Okay, now we will use these variables inside the dummy sampler. So let's go back to the dummy sampler here and define username and then dollar within flower brackets say username. Similarly password and then dollar within flower brackets password, and finally country within flower brackets country. Let's save this and then run the script. I also defined the dummy sampler name as thread and then the function iteration and the function. So you can see the dummy sampler name as thread 1, iteration 1, thread 2, iteration 2, something like that. Okay, so let's run this script. We have 3 threads and each thread will run 3 iterations because the loop count is 3. Thread 1 executed 3 times like iteration 1, iteration 2 and iteration 3. Similarly, thread 2 executed iteration 1, 2 and then 3, and the thread 3 executed 1, 2 and 3. So let's click on the thread 1 iteration 1 and then go to request. So if you see here in thread 1 iteration 1, JMeter used the variable name as user1, pass1 and India. So if you go back to user parameters, so this is the parameters that we defined for user1. Okay, and then go to the second iteration for thread 1. Here also it used user1 pass1 India, and then go to iteration 3. Again the same user1 pass1 India has been assigned to thread 1. So that means in user parameters, if we specify values for any specific user, so that user will be assigned to one thread and those values will be used to that thread irrespective of number of iterations that thread executed. Okay, so that means when we specify any values for a specific user, that specific user values will be assigned to one thread, and if that thread executed 10 times, so all those values will be repeated 10 times. Okay, and similarly if we go to thread 2 iteration 1, it is using the user2 values like user2 pass2 Canada, and then if you go to the second iteration of thread 2, we will be seeing the same values, and if you go to thread 2 iteration 3, again the same values. Similarly thread 3 user3 pass3 USA for the second iteration, and the final iteration also same. So this is the use case for user parameters. If you have any specific values to be assigned to specific threads, then you should be using user parameters. And we have one option which is update once per iteration. So that means if you want to update its variable only once per iteration, then we need to check this option. Okay, I hope it is clear to you. In case anything is not clear, please mention it in the comment section. Now let's look at the final element, which is CSV Data Set Config. Again, to save our time, I have created a simple script with one thread group, and I have defined the thread properties as number of threads equal to 2 and loop count as 1. Okay. And then within the thread group, I have one dummy sampler. So the main purpose of using this dummy sampler is to understand how JMeter is distributing the data when we execute the script with different threads. And another reason is whatever the sample application that we have over the internet, like Blaze Demo or Demo Blaze or JPEG Store, those are not our applications, right? I don't want to dump so much of data onto their applications. So that is why I'm not using those applications for explaining this config element. Moreover, whenever you are using this element, you need to understand how JMeter distribute the data. Then only you can prepare your test scenario accordingly. Okay, basically the CSV dataset config will read the data from a CSV file and we can use the data in the script. Okay. So for demonstration purpose, I have created a couple of CSV files. Let's look at those files now, and then we will come back to this configuration options. So I have saved those two files in the same folder where my JMeter script is. So testdata_s.csv and then testdata_l.csv. The main difference between these two files is the number of records. For example, in testdata_s.csv, I have only 5 records, and this is the dummy data. This is not any employee or any information. They just pick some random data from the internet. Okay. And if you open the other file, you can see more number of records. So here we have 50 records, and I have total 5 columns. Line 1, first name, last name, date of birth and email, and each data is separated with comma. Okay. And I will be using these columns as variables in our script. Okay. So let's close this file and go back to our script. So let's add the CSV dataset config at the test plan level. So right click add and then config element CSV dataset config. Now let's try to understand the different configuration options of this CSV dataset config element. Like other elements, we have name and comment, which we can leave it as defaults, and or if you want to keep some meaningful names, you can change it. And then we have configure the CSV data source section. So in this section, we have different options. The first option is file name. Here we need to specify the CSV file name. If your file exists in the same folder of the script, then you can simply specify the file name. You don't need to specify the absolute path. If the file exists in a different location, then you need to specify the complete path. Okay. Or you can also browse through your folders and then select that file. For example, my file exists in the JMeter scripts. So let me select this testdata_s.csv. When I open it, by default, JMeter will try to mention the complete path of that file. Since my script and this CSV file exists in the same folder, technically I don't need to specify this path. Okay, so let me delete that. And the next option is file encoding. Here we need to specify the encoding that JMeter needs to be used while reading this file. By default, this option will be empty and it is not mandatory. For some scenarios, if any specific encoding format needs to be used, then we can select that encoding from the given options. Okay, like we have UTF-8, UTF-16 and so on. And the next option is variable names. Here we need to specify a list of variables that we are going to use in the script. These variable names are mapped to those data in the CSV file. Okay, for some reason, if you are not mentioning anything here, then what JMeter will do is it will consider the first line in that CSV file as the variable names. Or if you want to define, you can also define it here like line and then first name, last name, etc. Okay. Since I have these names already defined in my CSV file, I'm not mentioning anything here. And the next option, ignore first line. And this option only be used if variable names is not empty. If we are specifying some variable name, then only this option will be used. Otherwise, it will be ignored. And the next option is delimiter. So here we need to specify the delimiter that we have used to split the columns in the CSV file. So if we go back to the CSV file again, we can see all the data is separated using comma. So this is the delimiter that we need to specify in that configuration. You can use any character, whatever the character that you are using in this file, you can specify that in the delimiter column. Okay, by default it will be used comma, so that is why I have used comma in the CSV file as well. And the next option, allow quoted data. if your CSV file contains some data with quotation, then you need to specify true, otherwise you can leave it as false. So in our case, we don't have any such data, so that is why I'm leaving it as false. The next option, recycle on EOF. Here EOF means the end of the file. So that means when JMeter reaches to the end of the file, what exactly needs to be done. So when we say true, then JMeter will try to reread the data from the beginning. If we say false, then it will stop reading the data there itself. Okay. And then next option, stop thread on EOF. Again, here we need to tell JMeter whether to stop the thread once it reaches to end of the file or not. So by default, it selects as false. That means JMeter will not stop that thread even if it reaches to end of the file. And then finally, we have sharing mode with different options like all threads, current thread group, current thread edit. Okay. So let's leave the default options in this CSV dataset config and then run the script to understand with the current sharing mode like all threads how the data is being distributed between different threads. So we have 2 threads with 1 loop count. So that means when we execute the script, there will be 2 requests sent to the server. And again, in the dummy sampler, I have referred those variables so that we can understand what is the line item that JMeter is using when it is reading the data from that CSV file. Okay, let's run the script and check the view results. So here, so as expected, there are 2 requests triggered. Thread 1 executed 1 request and then thread 2 executed 1 request. So if we go to thread 1 and then go to the request, then we can see when JMeter executed thread 1, it reads the first line item. Whatever the data in that first line, it read that item and then used it. Okay. And thread 2 read the second line of data. So that is the default behavior when we select the sharing mode as all threads. That means every thread will read the data one after another sequentially. Okay. Now let's increase the number of threads to 5 and then run the script again. So now we will see 5 requests. So each thread will trigger 1 request. So thread 1, first item, thread 2, second item, thread 3, third, thread 4, fourth, and thread 5, fifth. Okay. What will happen if we have more number of threads than the number of records in that file? So let's say number of threads as 6 and then rerun the script. Now if you see here, we have 6 requests and each request from 1 thread as we expected. So let's see which item thread 1 selected. It selected the first line item and then thread 2 second item, thread 3 third item, thread 4 fourth item, thread 5 fifth. When JMeter reaches to line 5, after that we don't have any other records, right? So for thread 6, it will be use the line number 1. This is because in the CSV dataset config, we said recycle on EOF equal to true. So that means when there is no more data, then we are asking JMeter to reread the data from the beginning. So that is why for thread 6, it has used the line 1. Okay. Let's say you don't want JMeter to reread the data again after reaching to the end of the file. Then you can make it as false. Let's rerun this script again to see what data thread 6 picked it in this case. So let thread 5 pick the 5. If you go to thread 6, you see it is saying EOF. It did not read any data. It simply says it reaches to the end of the file. Okay. What will happen if we say stop the thread on EOF? Let's make it as true and then rerun the script. Now we don't have 6 requests. Even though we in thread group thread properties we specified number of threads as 6, JMeter only executed 5 requests because in CSV dataset config we specified when it reaches to end of the file, we don't want JMeter to execute the thread, right? Instead we want that thread to be stopped. So since when thread 6 started the execution, JMeter already reached to the end of the file. So that is why it stopped the thread. It did not execute any request. So let's keep the defaults to these 2 configuration options. Now change the sharing mode to current thread. Again, change the number of threads to 2 and then rerun the script. When we select the sharing mode as current thread, what exactly will happen is that each thread will open the file separately. And this CSV data file will not be shared with all the threads. So each thread will get 1 copy. So that means when they try to read the data from this file, they will start reading from the beginning. Okay. Let's rerun this script again. We have number of threads 2 and loop count is 1 and then sharing mode is to current thread. Okay, let's run this. So again, as expected, we will have 1 request from each thread. So thread 1 will execute 1 request and thread 2 will execute another request. So in thread 1, we can see line 1. If you go to thread 2, we will also see the line 1 because the sharing mode option is current thread, and that means JMeter has given copy of the CSV file to each thread. So they will read the data from the beginning. Okay, let's say the number of threads as 5 and then rerun the script. So this time all these 5 threads will get a copy of that CSV file and every thread will start reading the data from the beginning. So even if I go to thread 1, I can see line 1, thread 2 line 1, thread 3 line 1, thread 4 line 1, thread 5 line 1. Okay, now let's make it the loop count as 2 and then see what will happen. Let's clear the results and then rerun this script. So now thread 1 executed 2 requests, iteration 1 and iteration 2. So thread 1 in the first iteration or the first request, it picked the first item, and the thread 1 in the second request or second iteration, it picked the second item. Similarly, if we see the thread 2, first iteration it picked the first item, and second iteration it picked the second item, and then third thread, first iteration first item, and then second iteration second item. This is the way the current thread option will work. Okay, now let's change the sharing mode to current thread group. When we select the current thread group option as a sharing mode, then what will happen is JMeter will share the CSV file to each thread group. So whatever the threads in that thread group will read that file from the beginning, same like current thread. Okay, the only difference is here a copy of the file will be given to each thread group, and all the threads inside that thread group will execute or read the data from the beginning. So to demonstrate this sharing mode option, I have created another thread group. So let me enable it, and let's change the thread property. So number of threads 2, loop count as 1, and then in thread group 2 also number of threads 2 and loop count 1. Okay, sharing mode current thread group, and let's clear the results and run the script again. Now we have 2 thread groups, and each thread group have 2 threads executing 1 request. That is why we have seen 4 requests. So in thread group 1, thread 1 in the first request it picked the first item, and in thread group 1 the second thread in the first iteration picked the second item. Same like all threads, right? And then if you see the thread group 2, the first thread in the first request it picked the first item, and then again in the thread group 2, the thread 2 picks the second item. I hope you understand the difference between the current thread and current thread group, right? So in current thread group, the copy of file was given to each thread group. So in that thread group, whatever the threads that we have configured will read the data sequentially one after another. This is the way this current thread group option will work. Okay, and then finally we have edit. So when we select this edit option, the sharing mode options becomes an input field. Here you can specify the thread group that you want to share this CSV file. Okay, so based on the requirement we can pick and choose the required configuration option. Okay, now let's change the file name as the file where we have large number of records, and then let's disable the second thread group and increase the thread count to 10, and then loop count as 5. Since the sharing mode option is to all threads, when we execute the script, what will happen? Every thread will try to read the data sequentially. So now we can see 50 requests. All the threads will try to share that CSV file and then read the data sequentially one after another. Okay, so you need to be very clear when we are configuring these options, because in real time you will get the data from different teams, or sometimes we will create our own data, right? So you need to know how much of test data that you need to be created or you need to be gathered from different teams for your test to be executed. Okay, so if you don't have enough data, then you may not be able to achieve the required throughput, or you may not be able to execute the realistic scenario. Okay, I hope you understand the CSV dataset config element. In case anything is not clear, please mention it in the comment section. So that's it for this video. Thank you so much for staying till the end and supporting me. I hope you understand the parameterization concept explained in this video. In case anything is not clear or require more details information, please feel free to mention it in the comment section. All the video notes have been uploaded in GitHub, and you can find the link in the description. If you are new to our channel, please consider subscribing and also like and share this video so that others will also get benefited. I'll see you with the next video in this module. Until then, take care, stay safe, and keep learning.